In this week's edition of Crop Tech Consults, we're going to piggyback a little bit on our starter discussion from last time and talk about seed quality, seed germ tests, and maybe how they fit into your starter decisions. There are, say, 4 seed germ tests that we have run in a lab, and really 3 of the 4 that we run most extensively. That we're looking at a little bit at seed quality, but definitely just seed characteristics and to try to determine where these seeds are going to produce the best, what kind of environment can we put them in to try to do to get the best stand possible on each piece or parcel of our ground. Probably the most common germ test out there right now is the warm germ test, performed at about 75 degrees. The results from this warm germ test are going to be very similar to the germ tests that are printed on the bags from the seed company themselves. It would be rare for seed to get all the way through production and to the retail market from a seed company with a bad warm germ test. So much so that in all of our testing we're running the warm germ and they match up to the bag so well that we don't usually run the warm germ in a way to cut some cost savings out of it. We're not running the warm germ test on our seed samples. We expect the warm germ to be adequate. What we do run, though, is a series of cold and saturated cold germ tests. With the cold germ test, they're storing the seed at 50 degrees for about 7 days and then pulling it out into 75-degree days and letting it germ. It's going to mimic conditions early in the season when the soil is cool. Maybe you don't plant right into cool soil, but it turns cold right after planting. It maybe stays that way for a significant period of time. So it's going to mimic that to a little bit degree. It's going to add some stress to that seed, and we're going to see how it overcomes that stress to actually get out of the ground and germinate. The saturated cold germ is very similar to that, only now we've put an 1/8 inch of soil in there. We've saturated that soil completely, and we leave it in 50-degree temperatures for 7 days. Then we bring it out into 75-degree day, 75 degrees, and we look at how the seed reacts. That's going to mimic cool, wet conditions early on in the spring that we might face with some of our first fields out of the ground, or some of those fields maybe that don't have the drainage we need, take a lot longer to warm up. We know there's portions of that field that we're always going to be planting to cool, wet conditions when compared to the rest of the field. If a seed itself has a poor cold germ or poor saturated cold germ, it doesn't mean that the seed quality is bad. It could have a perfectly good warm germ. It could be perfectly good seed. It's just not the seed we're going to be wanting to plant first out of the gate into cool, wet conditions or ahead of a cold spell that we know is coming in, because they would carry a higher degree of risk. Now, we may take seed with a less than the desirable cold or saturated cold germ to get the varieties that we want, that we know are going to produce the best in our operation, in our ground, and definitely in our conditions. So the saturated cold germ shouldn't scare you away from using that seed per se, especially if you know that's the genetics you need to produce on your farm. But you would take that into account, and when you're heading out the door to try 160 acres because all the neighbors are planting, everybody's going, and you got to plant something, that's probably not going to be the first variety into the planter. That's going to be subject to the most cool, wet conditions. We're going to pick one that has a high cold germ, a high saturated cold germ as our first stuff out of the gate. We know we can handle the conditions a little bit better, and we hope to get a better stand out of it. Another test we do run is a fast green or pericarp damage test. And what it does is we dip the seeds into a dye mixture, usually green, and we pull them out, rinse them off, and then we look at damage on the seeds. Scrapes, cracks in the pericarp will be actually dyed green in that instance. And we look at the location of those cracks as we go through it. Light damage, what's considered light, everything's divided into light, medium, severe damage. Light damage is damage at the base of the seed away from the embryo itself. Moderate damage is going to be damage alongside the embryo on the actual seed. Severe damage is going to be damage over top of the embryo itself. That carries the highest amount of risk when we actually damage that embryo or the seed directly above it. So you will get a rating back on a fast pericarp damage that tells you what percentage was in the light category, medium category, and severe. So then we have to ask ourselves, so what's a good test? What are good test numbers? In the worm germ test, 98 to 100% is a I guess, desirable number, and you're most likely going to have that, and it's even going to be printed on the bag for you. Cold germ is a more stressful test, so if we get above 90%, we're satisfied with those cold germ numbers. We look at saturated cold is even more stressful. We get above 85%. All right, we're going to be happy with those numbers. Now, just because it's below 85 doesn't make it a bad seed. Doesn't mean that you're going to have problems with germination. But if we're putting it out there, we want to make sure we're putting it out in conditions we're aware of how it's going to react. So it's not the first one out of the gate. It's not going in our cold, wet, saturated soils first thing in the season. Maybe we hold it back until the mid part of planting season, stuff dries out, warms up a little bit, and we plant it in there, and we shouldn't have any problems with it. With pericarp damage, we're looking at mostly the severe pericarp damage is what we want to focus on. We'd like that to be between 1 and 3%. It's not always possible, but that's where we want it. When we get above 3%, we start to get nervous about in-furrow starter applications on that seed. We get above 5 to 6% severe pericarp damage, we're going to shut in-furrow starters off. The risk of burn on that seed is so much greater and carries such a high risk when we get above 6% severe pericarp damage that we run the risk of losing too many seeds in furrow that no matter what kind of response we have from the starter, we can't overcome that at that stage. So above 6%, shut the starter off. If we're planting in conditions where we think it's too dry to germinate the seed, we don't think we're going to have enough moisture to germinate the seed, we also shut the starter off. So then we run the risk of overloading salt in the furrow with no soil moisture present. So when we're putting on starter, we want our severe pericarp below 6, ideally below 3, and we want to make sure that we're planting into adequate moisture to germinate that crop. Now, we're just talking about in-furrow starters. Yetter's quick response shoe, the Huck Step shoe that get it off the seed, any amount of 2x2 attachments that are outside of the actual furrow, we're not nearly as worried about the pericarp damage then because we're not placing a starter on the seed. But any starter that is going in furrow with the planter, we're going to be concerned with the pericarp damage. We want it to be below 3%. So, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.